They wanted to have a new life, another chance to make something of themselves in the land. And they all came down on the trains and started buying up all the land. And like he said, it was a thorn forest.
John McAllen, within a year, would marry Salome Bailly. So Salome Bailly would become Salome Bailly McAllen.
I'm Javier Villalobos, Mayor of McAllen, and I'm proud to welcome you to another episode of the McAllen Chamber of Commerce podcast. In this episode, we're joined by two respected voices who help preserve the story of our city. Dr. Francisco Guajardo of the Museum of South Texas History and John Kreidler of the McAllen Heritage Center. Together, they share powerful stories about our city's founding, its early families, and the deep cultural roots that continue to shape who we are today. On behalf of the city of McAllen, I'm honored to celebrate the people and moments that built our community. Let's listen in.
Hola, welcome. We're excited for another episode of the McAllen Chamber podcast. And we've got two really special guests with us today to talk about our favorite topic, which is McAllen, more specifically about the history of McAllen. Let me introduce our guests for the day. We have Dr. Francisco Guajardo, who is with the South Texas Museum of History. Welcome, Dr. Guajardo. It's amazing to have you here with us today. And then we've also got our McAllen historian joining us, the chairman of the board for the McAllen Heritage Center. We're so proud of the work that you all are doing at the Heritage Center and at the South Texas Museum of History. Let's get started this afternoon and have a good conversation about McAllen's history. First, though, tell us about your respective roles at the museum, what you do for the museum, and what your museum does for the community.
You first.
Okay. I work at the Museum of South Texas History. I'm the chief executive officer and have been for almost 6 years. The purpose of the museum, its mission, is to preserve and present the history and heritage of South Texas and also northeastern Mexico. We feel, I think not only philosophically, but as a mission statement, that northeastern Mexico and South Texas are interconnected in just about every way imaginable, culturally, historically, economically, politically. We are tethered together. And so our purpose is, as I said, to preserve and to present. When the museum was founded in the mid-1960s, its purpose was really according to its name. It was the Hidalgo County Historical Museum. And so its focus was very, very county-centric. In the year 2000, early in the year, in this millennium, the leadership of the museum decided that the museum could have a wider reach. And so the museum was renamed, rebranded from the Hidalgo County Historical Museum to the Museum of South Texas History. So my job is to essentially steward a group of people and a community to be able to embrace the idea of preserving and presenting the history and heritage of the region.
Wow, that's amazing. And I know the Heritage Museum does the same, but with a more specific mission to McAllen. Tell us a little bit more about that, John.
Well, this is the McAllen Heritage Center, which is the old U.S. Post Office in McAllen on Main Street. And we are if you will, the museum of McAllen's history. We have tons and tons of archives, pictures, memorabilia from the different decades as McAllen grew and prospered and became bigger and bigger and bigger. And we have so much stuff upstairs that we can't even bring down to the first floor. But we have tours where people can come in from Leadership McAllen. We have school tours. A lot of winter Texans come in when they're here in the winter to see what's going on in McAllen in the Heritage Center. And I am blessed to be the chairman of the board. I've been on there several years, and I've given a lot of stuff to the museum to put in their showcases. And it's really a lot of fun working there because I grew up here and I've seen the changes happen as I sort of grew up.
And that's amazing. And where do you start with such a rich history? Let's go back to McAllen's founding and early development. maybe share some insight on the founding of McAllen and some key stories that you might know that are worth noting in this program.
Well, mainly Mr. McAllen, John McAllen, wanted to start the town, and it was East McAllen. And then somebody else decided they needed to start one further west on 23rd and Business 83. And I recall that my father, when he was a kid, there were pictures of people that had been shooting deer in the brush right there on the corner, hanging up on a rack. And because my dad was born here in McAllen when there were midwives rather than, there's a hospital, but a lot of people use midwives. So he told me a lot of the history of what he saw growing up. And then when I think the one on 23rd and Business 83 got flooded in a rain, so those people said, well, I think we better move over to East McAllen. And that's really when the city started to grow. It was early on, 1907, 1908, 9, and then chartered in 1911. So they're just a year older than our funeral home.
Wow. Dr. Guajardo, but there's earlier history in this part of the world.
I think that when we look at any community in South Texas, I think we can see what we call today the Rio Grande Valley. That is really a modern kind of political, socio-cultural construct. So the valley was really branded early in the 1900s and would be branded essentially as this agricultural kind of society. And there was a boon, for many years that was very consistent with the agricultural industry. The history that, when we talk about the history of McAllen, and if we are to put it somewhere in the first decade of the 1900s, till today is really about this much compared to the broader sweep of history of people interacting with the land that is today McAllen, Texas. And so there's evidence that is very clear, archaeological evidence, that there were people here 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
And, when Christ was born and Christ walked the earth, people had been here already for 8,000 years interacting with the earth. And so the native people who came really as a result of the trickle effect of the last ice age, which was about 25,000 years ago, people then make it down here to what is today the valley. So 10,000, 9,000, 8,000 years ago, those folks figured out ways to interact with the earth here. In what is today McAllen and Hidalgo County, this was the classical thorn forest ecological system. It was very, very difficult to really traverse the ground here. And so we know this because there are writings from the early Spanish settlers. There was this guy named Juan Bautista Chapa, who was a chronicler of Nuevo León in the 1600s.
Wow.
Where his boss, a guy named Alonso de León, there's an elementary school here in McAllen named De León Elementary, named after the first governor of Nuevo León. When the viceroy said to De León, there's a French explorer out in Matagorda Bay named La Salle. Go repel him. De León takes his soldiers and his scribes, and they go to the river. From Nuevo León, they go to the river, and Bautista Chapa writes about this. He says, oh my God, there is a bosque ribereño, a riparian forest that was 10 miles south of the river, 10 miles north of the river, because the river, the Rio Bravo, in its natural state, used to overflow 2 or 3 times a year. And if there was a hurricane, it could overflow another time. And so the overflow of the water then created this forest. Here in McAllen, thorn forest.
Oh, wow.
So the native people, if they wanted to get to the most precious natural resource here, which was
water,
the Rio Grande, the other precious resource was the Sal del Rey. So salt and water. If they came to the water, they had to create these brechas, as Bautista Chapa described them. So Bautista Chapa also described a very, very wide river that was as wide as a harquebus could shoot.
Oh, wow.
Un arcabuz, that was a pistol of the time. That was about 900 feet. So people interacted with this, and the natives actually found this place to be both bountiful and inhospitable at the same time. So the natives who used to come here, who we kind of called in a sweeping way the Coahuiltecans,
Okay.
the natives who used to come here didn't stay here. They just came for the hunt, or they came, for forage. For the flora and the fauna here was very inhospitable, and then the rains. And so John interestingly mentioned the rains of early McAllen, but rains here have always been very, very consequential. So the native people were smart enough to move away from the rains because of the mosquitoes and the
Right.
inhospitable nature
Right.
of the ecology. And so this model of the Winter Texans is an age-old model that the native people here actually used.
And it makes sense, right?
It makes complete sense. And so the other point to be made here is that for 10,000 years, the native people here interacted with the earth. They didn't attempt to control the earth. They didn't kill all the buffalo because they needed some for next generation or 7 generations hence. They interacted with the earth. It was really a change in worldview when the Spanish came, and then when other settlers came with different ideas of how to establish societies and establish communities. When others came in with the idea of controlling the earth, which is basically the colonization of the land. That's a different worldview. The natives did not operate according to that because they needed the earth to survive.
To live.
So 1904, 1908, 1911 is really very, very recent in the annals of the history of this place. Now, it is when things speed up. It is the advent of modernity, and there's so many different issues and stories that really inform how that happened, and we'll probably talk about them here in the next few minutes. But the predicate here is that this was a place that was bountiful as much as it was inhospitable. We live with that duality today.
And isn't that repeating all of the time? Where it's like straddling two worlds at once. Absolutely.
Well, I think it is. And there is a very, very famous philosopher from Hargill, Texas, of all places.
Oh, wow.
This woman named Gloria Anzaldúa.
Oh,
who wrote,
yes, I know her.
You know the name, Gloria Anzaldúa.
Borderlands.
And so Borderlands, when she wrote Borderlands, she included there that this borderland exists as what she called una herida abierta.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is an open wound, and our job is to heal that wound. And so before we got on air, you talked about how the impact of the potential tariffs are affecting now international commerce. It's part of the wound. It is this ever-present wound of the border. How do you deal with this very, very dynamic kind of, moving and grooving kind of history and culture and economy? How do you deal with all this complexity? That's our challenge here.
And I think one of the things is knowing our history is so important, and knowing where we come from, because there's a pride to be had with that, to know that we're peoples in this area that have existed, beyond what we've known to be, right? The 1900s, and that we're a rich people and we're a strong people. And, I never forget being young, and MISD would take us to the museum, the International Museum of Art. And, even just walking in there, having that experience, feeling important enough that you're walking into a museum, because when you're growing up a poor kid, you don't have that access in your life. But I remember the first time going to Mexico and seeing our family history and knowing that history, the pride that you feel to know that we have a story that's important. And for us, that McAllen story is so rich. And I think it's important for us to pause and give that space, but to know that we continue to face a lot of similar challenges in our community. Why McAllen? Why that family? And how did they come into the picture?
Well, they came probably on the trains, like a lot of people that settled down here, because land was cheap. Mr. McAllen bought 640 acres for $3 an acre. I wish I could buy 640 acres for $3 an acre, but that's what drew people down here. They needed a lot of people from up north needed a new life. They wanted to have a new life, another chance to make something of themselves and the land. And they all came down on the trains and started buying up all the land. And like he said, it was a thorn forest. My father told me that when they wanted to go to San Antonio back in the early 20s, well, he was born in 25, but later 20s, early 30s, the road was a dirt road and it went to San Antonio. It took all day to get there because you had to take extra spokes for the wheels, extra tires, extra inner tubes, because going through the thorn forest, surely you're going to have a few flats here and there. So that people came down here to have a new life. And I think as they saw it starting to develop, they wanted to have a part of that pie and be a leader in that area here in McAllen.
So I think that if we get to the specific response to your question
Yes.
about why McAllen, there's a very colorful story, it seems to me, about how this happens, the McAllen thing. So there was a fellow by the name of John McAllen, who was from Ireland. He was born in 1826, and so you might see an image of John McAllen, who was born in 1826 in Londonderry in Ireland. And so right before the potato famine hit in Ireland, the potato famine of 1847, 48, there were as many as 100,000 Irish people who fled the island because they saw the writing on the wall, as it were. And so one of those people had left in 1845 was very young John McAllen. So John McAllen would come to New York City, would get on, on a boat, come across the ocean, and landed in New York City in 1845. And it was in New York City that changed his name from John McAllen to John McAllen. Now, John McAllen would then live in the Northeast, in New York City, and then went up to Boston for a bit. And so there was a craze in the mid-1840s out west. So I think that we all know the story of the gold rush in California. And so John McAllen, le acaban de cambiar el nombre, lo acaban de bautizar, ¿verdad? And so John McAllen gets wind of this, as so many young people were getting wind of this. So what would you do if you were in Boston or New York City in 1846, 1847? Would you get on a train and come across the country? No, because the Intercontinental Railroad had not been built. Not until the mass production of steel happened shortly thereafter. So what John McAllen does is he makes his way via the sea, where he finally makes it down to Matamoros. There was no Brownsville yet. Brownsville would not be founded until 1848 by Charles Stillman, who was already in the area, another guy from the Northeast, from Connecticut. And so when McAllen arrives in Matamoros, he finds a store, a business owned by a guy named John Young. John Young was from the old country. He was about 20-some years older than John McAllen. He was from Edinburgh in Scotland.
Oh, wow.
John Young was kind of a leader, an entrepreneur. He was very ambitious. He had a store. He hires a young man, John McAllen, as a clerk at his store. Now, John McAllen was on his way to California for the gold rush, but he can't really go until he builds some resources to be able to get some horses, a wagon, that sort of thing. Now, John McAllen is also very, very symbolic of a lot of young men who are going west. Young men who are going west from the East Coast to California were not going on ground. They were going around. They would come to Matamoros, and they would take a steamboat up the Rio Grande to Roma, and then they would cut right across a straight line to California. This is a story, right? John McAllen did not take a steamboat. Instead, he took his wagon, and he went up the river on the side. But when he went, it was 1847. Mexico had just been invaded by the United States. It was the Mexican War. So John McAllen was stopped in Monterrey and was told, go back. You can't go west. Go back. So McAllen was forced to go back to Matamoros, where he would regain employment with John Young. This is about 1847, 1848. John Young would then a few years later marry a Mexican woman who was Bayi, Salome Bayi. You see the image of Salome Bayi. Now, John Young was 25 years older than Salome Bayi. They were married for only about 7 years, 1853 to about 1860. And right before the Civil War, John Young died.
Wow.
John McAllen, within a year, would marry Salome Bayi. So Salome Bayi would become Salome Bayi McAllen. They would have a child, James, y de allí vienen los McAllens.
Oh, wow.
Now, John...
But how do they get from Matamoros here?
Well, I'm going to show you some images here. And understand this, though. We have to note here, Liz, that what we're talking about here is very recent history, right? And so before I tell you that Salome Bayi was one of the wealthiest people in the whole entire state of Texas, when you look at this image here, in 1860, before the Civil War, wealthy Texans, this is from an article from the Southwestern Historical Quarterly, Salome Bayi, at the age of 29, was one of the wealthiest people who lived in the state of Texas. Actually, yes. Right? And this is before the state of Texas became a state in the Confederacy, because that would happen in 1861. But I have to say, though, that before we get into this, I want to tell you the story of how Salome's value system would have been kind of shaped, and how the McAllen, City McAllen, you, Liz, you, John, me, how all of us are kind of shaped by our ancestral knowledge. When this one guy by the name of Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, an explorer of the early 16th century, so Cabeza de Vaca was a contemporary of people like Pizarro and Cortés, the conquistadores.
The conquistadores.
Yes. So Cortés in the Valley of Mexico, Pizarro, in South America. This guy, Cabeza de Vaca, was a conciliatory character. He wasn't about, bloodshed and that sort of thing. He was about evangelizing, so Christianizing, that sort of thing, the native people. Well, Cabeza de Vaca happened to be stranded off of the Gulf of Mexico, where he was shipwrecked in Galveston Bay, and he walked through what is today Texas in the 1530s. And Cabeza de Vaca was an astute observer. So he took mental notes of everything he was seeing, the flora, the fauna, the people. When Cabeza de Vaca was saved by some other Spanish people after walking here through by 8 years, Cabeza de Vaca was finally saved, and he went back to Spain, and he wrote a book, a travel diary about walking through here that he published in 1542. In that book that's entitled La Relación de Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, in one of his daily entries, he writes this. He called them these Indians, right? He says, these Indian people love their offspring the most of any in the world and treat them with greatest mildness. Esa gente india ama a sus hijos más que cualquier otra gente del mundo y los tratan con gran suavidad.
So that's unique, culturally unique.
Well, okay, so that's a good question.
We all have mamitis, is what they say in Spanish.
Okay. Hang on, Liz, because what you're suggesting would be that there is a uniqueness in how people love their children here compared to people in other parts of the world. The implication is that people in New York or people in China or people in Egypt do not love their children as much as people here. Well, I will say this. I think people everywhere love their children.
Of course.
But people here, however, there's a big however. We're so isolated from anything else. And this was such an inhospitable place. There were rattlesnakes. There were wild hogs. There were, all kinds of dangerous kind of fauna. And the flora was aggressive, the thorn forest. So you had to love your children. You had to care for your children in radical ways. So over a period of 10,000 years, that does something to the psychology and the behavior, the conditioned behavior of a people that I believe is in our ancestral knowledge. So I think that while people may love their children everywhere, people love their children here differently because they have to. And even though we may not be in the same inhospitable conditions today, it's still part of what makes people here. So when Salome comes of age as a Spanish woman who will become a Mexican woman and has access to this kind of, she was very Euro, but had access to this kind of indigenous life. When Salome comes of age, I would suggest to you that Salome comes of age as a very different person, somebody who was very impacted by family life and very likely was about radical love and radical care, and then marries somebody who comes from the old country who was ambitious, wide-eyed, adventurous. And so if you look at modern-day McAllen, that's kind of the confluence of the two very different world value systems.
And they unite in a special way, right?
They unite in a special, I think that's right. And so when you ask about did they have a lot of land or something like that, and I suggested to you that actually, yes, Salome was a very wealthy landowner because she had Bayi land from the Bayi land grants. She had Hinojosa land from the Hinojosa's land grants because they married. She had Gomez land. She had, Salome Bayi was very interconnected to the land grant system. When John Young married Salome, he gained privilege of land, but then he dies 7 years after. Then John McAllen marries Salome. He gains privilege of a lot of land. And then John McAllen also comes with this ambition, wide-eyed, it's a new world. You're an immigrant. There's a part of the reality of the immigrant.
Yes.
That you're always looking for a better life. It's the nature of the immigrant. So John McAllen and Salome, both very, very sort of like inspired and aspiring and ambitious. So that when you look at, say, the map here, and so I showed you the map of Hidalgo County. So this is, you can't really see that, but I'm going to see if I can zoom in. When you look at where McAllen is today, the boundaries of McAllen, okay, within those red lines, that's Porción 61, Porción 62, Porción 63, Porción 64, all owned by John McAllen and Salome Bayi. When Salome Bayi died in 1898, the land had already been developed, owned by John and Salome, so that they had a lot of leverage points that were economic, that were land-based. So when John McAllen, with others, formed the McAllen town site in 1904, and he donates some land. Now, the municipality would not become formalized until 1911. It was with a vision that John McAllen had, with a vision to really create a modern society, as much as he loved his ranch.
And boy, that vision has carried McAllen, that vision for business, because when we look even at the history of the valley, McAllen didn't have any of the real geographic advantages that per se Brownsville would have, or at that time, even the infrastructure that a city like Rio Grande City had, Roma had. How did that business mentality really shape who we've become today and that vision, John?
Well, from my perspective, my great-grandparents moved to San Juan in 1909, and all of a sudden they realized this town's not growing. So they moved to McAllen, and that's how the funeral home got started. But from my perspective, it seems that from the early days, the mayors and the city commissioners all had a vision that a lot of people didn't have about McAllen growing and becoming a financial center, a cultural center, a business center, and that was their goal, was to develop that. And of course, the chamber was very involved in that for many, many years, helping to get people down here to try to get them to come to bring their business here. And then, of course, with the trade zone being developed and the twin plant concept, that just, boy, it really took off then. And I think that we've had, very fortunately, have had very harmonious city government all these years, and people have the vision and they push the envelope further and further and further to make McAllen the best it can be.
And it's an adventurous spirit of our business community because, as I've been doing the rounds with industry, going to Reynosa, we have to drive down McAllen Road or street, which is where all of the maquilas are. And to think that he had a vision that there was no NAFTA, there was no free trade, and there was no reason for him to support that, but he had a vision. And I guess that adventuresome spirit continues in our people.
He told me that when he was a priest, he would be doing school and everything, and he didn't feel like the kids were getting the proper education. So he quit being a priest and started working as, in a sense, a teacher. And then when he got a hold of MEDC, he started telling them, you need to start teaching these kids that graduate from high school trade skills. We need skilled workers here in the valley if we're going to grow. And that was McAllen's big push.
But that's a radical approach too, because he's
Sure.
not necessarily building here, he's building there with the vision that what you build there is connected here. And I think that interconnectedness is a part of our history. Let's talk a little bit about, go ahead.
Can I
Yes.
just respond to this? Because I think that there's precedent and antecedent here to the adventurous spirit. And there's some historical narratives that really shape and this kind of spirit. And so one of the narratives that I want to speak to is about this guy. And so this guy was Klausner. His name was John Klausner. And I think that John Klausner is a real character, but he's also metaphor. He represents, he's a symbol for an age. So John Klausner was born before the Civil War in Wisconsin, 1853. He comes to Texas in the 1870s with his family. He's a kid, and he comes to Texas to work on the railroad. As a railroad, the Great Northern Railroad is going through Texas and into Mexico. So Klausner works on the railroad for a few years, sort of comes of age, understands the power of this thing called steel. Because steel in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s was helping to build cities. Because now you could build up, right, and have a structure be strong. Now you could build a railroad and have a train follow the railroad. So John Klausner, when he comes, he sees a different vision, the vision really of the country. Klausner decides to stay in South Texas. He becomes like a county official and runs for county sheriff in 1890. He becomes the Hidalgo County Sheriff. And as a county sheriff, he was very, very in the know about who wasn't paying taxes on properties. And especially during the Great Recession of 1893, when the whole world, went into this economic angst, and a lot of ranchers in South Texas. And by the way, John Klausner was not enamored with the whole ranching thing. He thought that ranching was not the way to generate a lot of wealth. He thought there would be another way. And so his way would come really through railroads and a new way of life, new economy. Klausner would take a lot of lands, which he could, as a sheriff. He would get lands and bring them to the county and put them up for auction, lands where people were not paying their taxes. And oftentimes, John Klausner was the only person in the room during the auctions.
Buying them.
25 cents an acre. John Klausner gobbled up a lot of land.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
pretty
what
cheap.
and so this is very close to your story, John, because if you grew up or your parents came to San Juan, John Klausner would actually buy large swaths of land right north of the river, and he would build the San Juan plantation. He built a pump house in 1896,
Right.
had unlimited access to water, and in 1904, he grew the most beautiful sugar cane, and he entered sugar cane at the World's Fair in St. Louis, Missouri, at the World's Fair,
Wow.
and he won the gold medal. He won the gold medal, and we have the gold medal at the museum. Yes. In 1904, when John Klausner wins the gold medal, the great investors for the greatest crop in the world, and the big investors of the day are sitting right in front of him. There's a guy on the front row named Henry Farr. He was there. He's an investor. He would come down to the valley eventually, right? 1908, 1909. John Klausner, when he wins this in 1904, really signals the turning point in the history of South Texas, because 1904 is a watershed year. 1904 is when John McAllen creates a town site. 1904 is when the train comes. 1904 is when the chambers of commerce come. 1904 is when the land development companies come. 1904 is when we see the creation of what geographers call place myth, the Magic Valley.
Wow.
The Magic Valley is a social construction. The Magic Valley is almost like Vegas. Vegas would not exist without, without Hoover Dam, Glen Canyon Dam, these things that are able to generate electricity and power to create a city. It's not a magic valley. It was branded. This was inhospitable for thousands of years. When John Kreidler does this and everything sort of emerges, this is when McAllen emerges. And when McAllen emerges, the cheerleader of this new town was none other than the McAllen Monitor. It wasn't even a municipality yet,
Wow.
but the McAllen Monitor already existed. This is the very first issue of the McAllen Monitor that I'm showing you here. And if you look very closely...
What's the date on that one?
I'm going to show you. It is 1909. This is December 11th, 1909. When the McAllen Monitor was created, you see all the writing on page 1. Look at how McAllen is seeing itself on a building boom. If you look at the outline, the people here have no time to waste in crowing over what they have done, what they are doing now, or what they intend to do. The newspaper's mission. The McAllen Monitor is actually the mouthpiece for the vision of this city that doesn't even exist yet. East McAllen is fighting against West McAllen. Then they come to their senses in 1911 and they say, let's just consolidate. And in 1911, they say, stop it, let's just be one. In 1911 is when they create the municipality. But the kind of rhetoric that sort of carried the day was being carried by the Monitor. When you say the spirit of this and the spirit of that, we see it. Just keep looking. The store of B.F. Love, Gregory Walton, the First State Bank, the McAllen Hotel, Knights of Pythia's Lodge, $3,500 printing plant, the Methodist Church. McAllen is coming satisfactorily, it says. When this panoramic picture was taken in 1911, it's part of one big photograph. You see the railroad. This is 1911. McAllen was just being born as a municipality. This is 1911. There is a rhetorical precedent to how people see themselves in this community that's rooted in the first decade of the 1900s. There is a rhetorical precedent in how people are with each other that's rooted in the language of 1530s and 1540s of cabeza de vaca. There is a precedent in how people are here in the matrimonio
Of
John McAllen and Salome Bailly. I think that there are historical antecedents here that if we are to obey them, one could say, okay, that makes sense. That's why this place is the way it is. Now, we could easily screw it up, you understand. But I think that there's been this almost like implicit obedience to its history. Whether people know the history or not, it doesn't matter. It's almost like
It's ingrained in us.
At the cellular level, one could say.
I would agree. Because we always have believed we're big.
Yeah.
And we can get bigger.
Everything in Texas is big.
But McAllen is different, I think.
But hang on, because there is that notion of these Indian people love their offspring that I think is more profound and carries a spirit also of taking care of one another that is really kind of the cornerstone of the entrepreneurship and spirit of industry. It really is about having the family at the center. I mean, as a researcher, I was a researcher for many years as a university professor, conducted all this empirical research, and every time the lessons showed it's about the family, it's about the children. And not just anecdotal, but real. So when you look at not just McAllen, I think it's Edinburgh, it's San Juan, it's Brownsville, it's Mission, that there seems to be this monolithic thinking about the most important unit of analysis here is the family. And that, I think, is what drives the culture and even the economy of the region.
And I would agree that the family doesn't just mean literal offspring, because when you sit here, as we have over the last few months with each business podcast, the family for the McAllenite is the fellow McAllenite. And there's a real spirit of giving back. There's so much rich history. I know we're tight a little bit on time, but I want to talk a little bit about the importance of each of the museums and what are some ways that we can inspire our community, our business community, our families to continue to seek their history, to preserve it. Talk to us a little bit about your mission and how do we support it?
Well, at the McAllen Heritage Center, there are a lot of people that show up that are thinking about moving here and they want to learn about McAllen. Where better to go to learn is go to a museum that's nothing but McAllen history. And that's part of our mission. But we are also an educational, if you will, an educational institution, because when people come in from schools and, like I said, Leadership McAllen, they're learning a lot about how McAllen progressed. And if they want to become a part of that, then they need to, like, join the chamber, get active at the Heritage Center as a docent or something like that, but also to realize that the future is theirs if they want to take a part of it. And that's the nice part about this museum having nothing but McAllen history, because you're not going to be worried about, in a sense, what goes on over at Museum of South Texas History, because they go back a long way before we even started this. And but we want people to know about McAllen and the possibilities and the positiveness of the folks of McAllen. Because like you said, you take from McAllen, you have to give back to McAllen. That's your duty and obligation. And it's been a real pleasure being on the board, because we see all kinds of people. And a lot of times I'll do a tour for the McAllen leadership deal. My father used to do it with his wife. And it's been really great. But we have more stuff than we know what to do with. That's why we're trying to build an annex on the north side of the museum to have more meeting rooms, more storage, more exhibits. We do a lot of traveling exhibits. We're trying to honor local heroes. We have the military part where the people that were from McAllen that were in the military can come with their picture when they first got in and what they look like now, and it's in an exhibition of that. It's really been a pleasure to see it develop as it has. We have some great mosaics that Elva got someone to do for us with the McAllen iconic buildings, and we've done a lot of remodeling. We have, because it used to be called La Placita, and it was like a kind of a downtown bus stop. There was public bathrooms and lockers and things like that, but we needed a place for all our stuff. And when Helen Chisholm died, she left everything that she had to the McAllen Heritage Center, and she and her family had been collecting memorabilia from the time they moved here way back in the early years, and her house was just full of it, and she left every bit of it to the Heritage Center. So Elva and Nedrick Nurk and Spud Brown, they went through all that stuff and started trying to transport it over to La Placita and find a place for it. So that's why we're trying to build a new annex, and we're in the middle of a campaign, a financial campaign.
And how can people support that campaign?
All they have to do is call and say, hey, I'd like to give you $100,000 to help you build your building. And we'll take anything they're willing to donate. We're trying to finish the campaign so we can get started on construction.
Good. Well, I'm excited to hear that. What about the South Texas Museum of History? There's so many
it's called
projects.
The Museum of
South
Texas History. Yes.
Forgive me.
So the acronym is MOST
Okay.
History, just to make it easier. Museum of South Texas History. There's kind of a famous book entitled "A People Without a History." It talks about parts of the demise of certain places in Europe, during a couple centuries ago. The lesson there is that when a community doesn't really understand its history, individual people really don't understand themselves, that they are setting themselves up for a calamitous kind of future. When people understand themselves individually and their families and their community, they can proceed with a level of insight of what happened before. They can make more informed decisions because they know the environment, they know the economy, they know what's up because they've been reflective about who they are. The function of a museum is basically to be a mirror for you to look at yourself. If you cannot do that well, you're probably missing out on your purpose. So in our case, it's to preserve and to present. And so we get the letters of, a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, for example. How are we going to use that? So we're going to curate those letters so that the community can see the stories of this one person, so that the community can see themselves in it. So at the Museum of South Texas History in Edinburgh, we get about 15,000 children per year who come as part of school tours. We get thousands of other people from the community at large that come to see their stories, see themselves in history. We have beautiful permanent galleries that are the River Frontier, River Highway, where we feature the steamboat, and we're developing the story of the Underground Railroad as it came through South Texas in the 1840s and 1850s and even into the 1860s, and their families here that settled in Far and settled in Donna, what is today Far and Donna. In the 1850s, they became conductors on the Underground Railroad. So we're featuring those stories because we have the oral histories of the families and also documents that corroborate, triangulate that story. That's a fantastic story. We have the 1910 jail, which is the oldest building in Edinburgh. That is the original building of the museum. And so in the old 1910 jail, where there was a hanging in 1913, and some people are spooked when it comes in, when they come in. And so the biggest question people have, the most prominent question is this museum haunted? So I say to people that it is haunted if you want to believe that it's haunted. If you don't want to believe that it's haunted, then it's not. But I'll just end with this, that a community that is a thriving community is a community that has a sense of identity. A community that has a sense of identity is a community that invests in its cultural institutions. And the museum is an important cultural institution in a community. And so we've had through the years, capital campaigns to grow. At some point, we'll have a capital campaign as well because
Absolutely.
we need to grow. And we have ongoing rotating exhibits as well that we bring in from other places or that we build ourselves. We have the meteorite, for instance, that landed in Starr County in 2023, where one meteorite dashed from space and hit a mesquite, and the meteorite shattered, and the mesquite did not. What's the story there? I think that mesquite kind of encapsulates who we are as a people.
Well, I think that's a great way to end this segment, but I think we've got more segments to have with both of you. What a great way to really end by reminding ourselves the beauty in our culture, the strength that comes in our history, and this adventuresome spirit that really has been the mold by which we have gained great success. May there be continued successes for all of our business community, but may we continue to instill in our children the pride of our history. And so with that, I want to thank both of you gentlemen. Thank you for all that you do for our community. When you're that kid that gets to walk into one of your museums, that gets to see themselves in the mirror, you're really changing our lives. So thank you for all that you do. And thank you for joining us at the McAllen Chamber of Commerce. I remind you, join the chamber, come to our programming, come meet all of the things that make our community dynamic. Thank you so much.